Eula Bonner was 28 years old and lying in the bottom of a dry wash in the Arizona Territory with a broken collarbone and a split lip, left there to die by the only family she had left in the world. It was her late husband's brother, Garrett Bonner, who had put her there, driving her out at first light with a borrowed wagon and a lie about visiting her sister in Prescott, only to stop the team at the rim of Calder's Canyon, take her down by the arm as if helping her stretch her legs, and shove her over the edge where the rock gave way to gravel and brush. He told her before he turned the wagon around, that the ranch had never been hers to keep, whatever the paper said, and that the territory was full of canyons that swallowed careless women and never gave them back. What she had in this world after that fall amounted to $4 silver sewn into the hem of her petticoat, a tin of matches, and the clothes on her back, and 3 weeks later, half-healed and hollow-eyed, she would spend 3 of those dollars on a worthless sandblasted homestead claim at the canyon's mouth that the county clerk practically laughed at her for wanting. A crumbling line shack and 40 acres of nothing that no rancher in Cochise County would touch with a 10-foot pole. It was, by any sensible measure, a fool's purchase, the last gasp of a desperate woman throwing away her final coins on a pile of rotten timber and stone. But sealed beneath that floor, wrapped in oilcloth and bound with rawhide gone stiff as bone, was something that had waited a generation to be found, something that would not only deliver Eula Bonner from the canyon that nearly killed her, but would settle a debt the whole town of Paloma Flats had carried, unknowing, in its bones for 23 years. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Eula Bonner. If you are watching this from a place that has been written off by everyone who ever should have loved it, tell us in the comments. We have a feeling you already know exactly what kind of story this is. Eula had not always been a woman with nothing to her name. She had been born Eula Prescott, no relation to the town though folks always asked, in a sod house outside of Lordsburg in the spring of 1858, the third of 6 children to a freight-hauling father and a mother who could stretch a single chicken into 4 meals and still have broth left for the baby. It was her mother, Ruth Prescott, who taught her the skill that would, in the end, save her life twice over: the reading of ledgers, the keeping of accounts, the patient unraveling of numbers until they told the truth a man's mouth would not. Ruth had kept the books for every freight contract her husband signed, sitting up by lamplight with a stub of pencil while the children slept, and she had taught Eula at her elbow from the time the girl was 9 years old, showing her how a column of figures could hide a lie as easily as a face could, and how the careful eye would always, eventually, find the seam. Numbers don't forget, her mother used to say, even when people decide to. Eula had a gift for it that surprised even her mother, a mind that could hold a string of figures the way other girls held melodies, and by the time she was 16 she was keeping books not just for her father's freight line but, quietly, for 2 of the merchants in Lordsburg who paid her in coin and swore her to secrecy because it embarrassed them to need a girl's help. She learned something else in those years too, something her mother modeled without ever naming it: that a person's worth was not stamped on the outside of them, that the chipped cup could hold the sweetest tea, that the overlooked corner of a ledger was often where the truth was kept. It was a philosophy that would carry her through every hard year that came after, though she could not have known, as a girl bent over her mother's account books by lamplight, just how hard those years would be. She married Thomas Bonner in the spring of 1879, when she was 21 and he was 26, a rancher's son with sun-browned forearms and a laugh that came easy and often, and for a handful of years it seemed as though her life had settled into the kind of quiet good fortune that her mother had always prayed for her. Thomas had inherited, along with his younger brother Garrett, a modest spread west of a town called Paloma Flats, a place tucked against red rock country where the Sonoyta wound down out of the hills, and Eula brought to that marriage not just her hands and her heart but her ledger-keeping mind, taking over the ranch's books within the first year and turning a property that had limped along under the brother's father into something that actually paid its debts and put a little aside besides. Thomas trusted her completely with the numbers, told anyone who'd listen that his wife was sharper than any banker in 3 counties, and for 6 years the Bonner ranch prospered under her quiet stewardship while Garrett, the younger brother, watched with a smile that Eula, looking back, would realize had never quite reached his eyes. Garrett had a taste for cards and a worse taste for whiskey, and more than once Thomas had to cover debts his brother ran up in Tombstone or Bisbee, debts Eula recorded faithfully in the ledger with a small, disapproving notation beside each one, never imagining that those very notations were being read, resented, and remembered by a man who believed the ranch should rightfully be his to spend as he pleased. The fall began, as these things so often do, with a death that should have settled nothing but settled everything. Thomas Bonner was thrown from a Greenbrook gelding in the autumn of 1885 and lingered 3 days before he died, and in his dying he left the ranch to his wife outright, a fact recorded plainly in a will drawn up 2 years before by a circuit judge who had stopped in Paloma Flats and happened to know both brothers' characters well enough to guess which one ought to be trusted with the deed. Hans and Thomas's own trust, Garrett's grief curdled into something colder. He began, over the following winter, a slow campaign of erosion, turning Hans against her with whispered doubts about a widow's competence to run cattle, letting fences go unmended so the blame would fall on her management, and finally, in the spring of 1886, forging a transfer of deed with the help of a corrupt notary in Bisbee who owed him a gambling debt, a document that named Garrett Bonner sole owner of the ranch and that he intended to file the moment Eula was no longer alive to dispute. He had not planned at first to harm her outright. Even Garrett, in his self-justifying way, balked at outright murder, but when she discovered the forged transfer hidden among his things and confronted him with it, demanding he burn it and leave the ranch for good, his fear of exposure overcame whatever scrap of conscience remained to him. He told her they would drive to Prescott to see her sister, to clear her head, after such an upsetting discovery, and instead drove her to the rim of Calder's Canyon, where the road narrowed and the rock fell away sharp on one side, and there he did what he told himself in the moment, was simply leaving her to find her own way, knowing full well there was no way to find, that the canyon floor was 40 feet down and strewn with broken stone, that a woman with no food and no water and a broken body would not likely walk out of it alive. But Eula did not die. She fell through brush that slowed her, struck a ledge that broke her collarbone instead of her neck, and lay stunned for the better part of a day before a Mexican goat herder named Refugio Salcido, working the canyon floor for stray kids, found her half buried in scrub oak and carried her 3 miles on the back of his mule to his family's small holding, where his wife Soledad set her bone with splints of mesquite and nursed her through a fever that nearly finished what the fall had not. Eula stayed with the Salcidos 6 weeks, working what little strength she had into mending and cooking in exchange for their kindness, telling no one in Paloma Flats that she had survived, because she understood with a clarity that frightened her that Garrett believed her dead, that he would by now have filed his forged deed and claimed the ranch, and that a battered widow with no proof and no money would stand little chance against a man who had already shown what he was willing to do to keep what he wanted. When at last she was well enough to travel, Refugio drove her in his cart as far as the crossroads above Paloma Flats and pressed into her hand a small sack of dried beans and the $4 silver his wife had been saving toward a new washtub, refusing every protest, telling her only, in his careful English, that a debt repaid to one stranger was a debt owed to the next, and that someday she would pass it on. She walked the rest of the way into town with her arms still bound in a sling, and learned within the hour, from the startled face of the dry goods clerk who nearly dropped his ledger at the sight of her, that Garrett Bonner had indeed filed his deed, had told the whole town his sister-in-law had run off east in grief and shame after losing the ranch to gambling debts she'd hidden from her husband, and was at that very moment living in the ranch house she had built into solvency with her own hands, drinking from her own dishes. She did not go to him. She understood, standing in that dry goods store with the clerk staring at her like she was a ghost walked in off the desert, that she had no proof of the forgery, the document itself had vanished, doubtless burned the moment Garrett believed her dead, and that her word against his, the word of a woman the whole town now believed had abandoned her husband's memory in disgrace, would carry no weight in any court in the territory. She had $4 silver, a body still mending and nothing else in the world, and she made up her mind in that single bitter hour that she would not beg Garrett Bonner for so much as a cup of water, that she would build something of her own from nothing if that was what it took, the way her mother had taught her that nothing was ever truly nothing if you looked at it closely enough. It was 3 days later, wandering past the county land office more out of habit than hope, that she saw the notice posted in the window. A tax forfeit parcel at the mouth of Calder's Canyon, the very canyon that had nearly killed her, 40 acres and a derelict line shack, to be sold for back taxes owed, minimum bid $3, no reasonable offer refused on account of nobody in their right mind wanting it. The clerk, a thin, balding man named Aldous Ferris who had clearly never expected a buyer, tried gently to dissuade her, explaining that the land had belonged decades back to a man nobody much spoke of anymore, that the shack itself was said to be unlucky, that the canyon water was unreliable and the soil thin as a wafer, and that for $3 she could likely find herself a room in town instead and look for honest work. But Eula had already decided, with the strange, stubborn clarity of a woman who has run out of every other option, that there was a kind of justice in the notion of claiming, with her own hard-won coin, a piece of the very ground that had tried to bury her, that if the canyon could not kill her, she would make it answer to her instead. She paid her $3 silver, watched Ferris stamp the deed with visible reluctance, and walked the 6 miles out to the canyon mouth on a collarbone that still ached with every jolt of her steps, carrying her tin of matches and her sack of dried beans and the single remaining dollar that stood between her and absolute ruin, to take possession of 40 acres of sand scrub, and a shack so old and sun-silvered it looked less built than grown, like something the desert itself had pushed up out of the ground and then abandoned in disgust. The shack, when she reached it in the long gold light of early evening, proved even more forsaken than she had braced herself for. A single room of rough-hewn timber gone gray and split, a roof patched in places with flattened tin that had rusted through, a door hanging by one leather hinge, but there was, she noted with the same practical eye that had once kept the Bonner Ranch's books, a stone chimney still sound, a well some 50 yards off that Ferris had assured her still ran sweet most seasons, and 4 solid walls between her and the coyotes that called in the rocks above. She swept the floor with a bundle of greasewood branches lashed together, patched the worst gap in the roof with a scrap of her own petticoat soaked in mud, and slept that first night on a bed of dried grass with the canyon wind moving through the cracks like something breathing, and told herself, as she had told herself every night since the fall, that she was alive, and that being alive was a thing a person could build on, however little else they had. It was on her third morning in the shack, working at last with strength enough to do more than simply survive the night, that she noticed something her exhausted eyes had missed before. That one section of the packed earth floor in the corner nearest the chimney sat noticeably higher than the rest, as though something had been buried beneath it and the earth tamped back down imperfectly over the top. She might have dismissed it as nothing more than an old root cellar, the kind of shallow dugout many frontier cabins kept for storing root vegetables through the winter, except that when she knelt and pressed her palm flat against the raised earth, she felt beneath it not the give of loose soil but the unmistakable resistance of wood, a buried floorboard or the lid of something built to last. She worked at it for the better part of an hour with a flat stone for lack of a proper spade, scraping away years of hardened dirt and the matted nests of pack rats, until at last her fingers found the edge of a trapdoor no larger than a wash-basin lid, its iron ring rusted nearly solid, and when she finally wrenched it free with both hands and the leverage of her whole exhausted body, she found beneath it a shallow stone-lined cavity, dry as old bone, containing a single bundle wrapped in oilcloth and bound round and round with rawhide gone stiff and dark with age. She sat back on her heels in the dust of that ruined cabin and stared at the bundle for a long while before she touched it again, some instinct telling her that whatever this was, it had been hidden with care and purpose, not simply lost, and that the finding of it might carry consequences she could not yet guess at. When at last she cut the rawhide with the small folding knife she'd kept sewn into her boot since the canyon, the oilcloth fell away to reveal a leather-bound journal, its pages foxed and brittle but still legible, and folded inside its front cover, a hand-drawn map of the canyon and the hills beyond it, marked in a cramped, slanting hand with symbols she did not at first understand. The journal's first page bore a single name, written boldly across the top in ink long since gone the color of dried blood, Royal Cutter. She did not recognize the name, but something in the careful, deliberate way the journal had been hidden, sealed beneath a false floor in a shack that the whole county seemed eager to forget, told her she had stumbled onto something that mattered far more than the $3 she had paid for the privilege of finding it. Over the following days, working by the light of her small fire each evening after a day spent making the cabin barely livable, Eula read Royal Cutter's journal from its first brittle page to its last, and what she pieced together both chilled and fascinated her in equal measure. Royal Cutter, it emerged, had been a rider with the Hartwell Gang, a band of outlaws who had terrorized stage lines and small-town banks across the Southern Territory in the years just after the war, and who had, in the autumn of 1863, robbed the Paloma Flats Trust and Savings of nearly $11,000 in gold coin and bank notes. A sum that, in a town of fewer than 400 souls, had represented not the wealth of a few rich men but the pooled, hard-won savings of nearly every family in the valley, deposited there over years of careful scraping and saving against drought, illness and old age. The robbery had broken Paloma Flats in a way no drought ever had, Eula read in Cutter's own cramped hand, written years after the fact with what struck her as genuine and aging remorse. Men had lost their land when they could not make good on loans the bank itself could no longer honor, families had scattered east, and at least 2 of the depositors, by Cutter's own grim accounting, had taken their own lives in the despair of total ruin. Cutter himself, it seemed, had carried the bulk of the stolen gold away from the gang in the chaos following a botched ambush by a posse in these very canyon hills, fleeing alone with the loot strapped to a single mule while his fellow riders were run down or scattered. And rather than rejoin them or spend the fortune as a free man, something in him had broken or turned, some late and reluctant conscience asserting itself in the years that followed. He had drifted, by his own account, for nearly 2 decades under an assumed name, working as a hand on ranches from Texas to California, never able to bring himself either to spend the gold or to return it, paralyzed by guilt on one side and fear of the noose on the other, until at last, old and ailing and certain his death was near, he had returned in secret to the canyon under cover of night, built this very shack as a hermit's last refuge, and spent his final months hiding the gold not as treasure to be reclaimed but as a confession waiting to be discovered, mapping its location with such care that anyone who found the journal could, if they chose, restore what had been stolen to the very town it had been stolen from. The last entry, dated some 23 years prior to the night Eula read it by firelight, was brief and unsteady, written in a hand clearly failing. He asked whoever found this to forgive an old fool who had taken the coward's path twice over, once in the robbery and again in the hiding, and begged that the gold be returned to Paloma Flats, to the families whose names he had carefully listed on the journal's final pages, the original depositors and their descendants so far as he had been able to trace them in his wandering years. Eula sat with that journal open on her knees long after her small fire had burned to embers, turning over in her mind the staggering shape of what she had found. Not merely a fortune, though it was certainly that, but a debt 23 years overdue to a town that did not even know it was owed, a debt whose repayment could undo, in some measure, ruin she herself understood far too well, having so recently been a woman with nothing standing in the wreckage of what should have been hers. She thought, too, with a clarity that startled her, of the irony folded into the discovery, that Garrett Bonner, who had left her for dead in this same canyon believing her claim to the Bonner ranch a thing he could simply erase with a forged signature and a shove off a cliff, had unwittingly driven her to the one piece of ground in the entire territory that held the means to set right a wrong far older and far larger than her own. She did not for a moment imagine the gold was hers to keep. Her mother's voice rose up in her memory as clearly as if Ruth Prescott stood beside her in that ruined cabin. Numbers don't forget, even when people decide to, and a debt recorded honestly does not vanish simply because the years have passed. She resolved, sitting there in the dark with Royal Cutter's confession in her lap, that she would find the gold exactly as he had mapped it, and that she would see it return not to herself but to the families whose names filled those final fragile pages. Though she understood, even as she made that resolution, that a woman alone, recently believed dead, recently disgraced by her own brother-in-law's lies, possessed of nothing but a worthless shack and a single dollar, would face no small task in proving any of what she had found, let alone carrying it out without being robbed of it herself or worse. The map led her, over the better part of a week of careful searching through the canyon's folded rock and brush, to a narrow side draw some 2 miles north of the shack, where an outcropping shaped like a crouching dog, Cutter had even sketched a small dog beside the symbol on his map, with the dry humor of a man who'd had little enough left to laugh about, marked the entrance to a shallow cave mouth nearly hidden behind a fall of boulders. It took her the better part of 2 more days, working with a borrowed pry bar. She walked 6 miles into town and back to buy on credit from a blacksmith who took pity on the gaunt, determined widow everyone now whispered about, to clear enough rock to squeeze into the cave's interior, where she found, exactly as the journal had promised, for iron-bound strongboxes half buried in the cave's dry floor, their locks long rusted but their contents, gold coin mostly with a quantity of bank notes. Too brittle and damp-stained to be of use, but the coin itself bright and untouched by 23 years of darkness, entirely intact. She did not move the boxes. She understood, sitting back on her heels in that cave with her lantern guttering and her hands trembling not from fear but from the sheer enormity of what lay before her, that to carry this gold into Paloma Flats alone, as an unknown and disgraced widow with no proof of her story beyond an old outlaw's journal, would invite suspicion, theft, or worse, and that she needed, before anything else, both a witness she could trust and a plan that would not collapse the moment Garrett Bonner caught wind of what she had found. She thought first of Refugio and Soledad Salcido, the family who had saved her life and asked nothing in return, and she walked the long miles to their small holding to lay the whole truth before them, trusting Refugio's quiet steadiness and his family's evident decency more than she trusted anyone left in Paloma Flats itself. Refugio listened to her account without interrupting, turning the journal's pages with careful work-roughened hands, and when she finished he was quiet for a long moment before he told her that he had heard his own grandfather speak, when he was a boy, of the Hartwell robbery and the ruin it had brought to families he had known, and that if what she said was true, then God himself had seen fit to deliver this reckoning into the hands of a woman who understood, better than most, what it meant to lose everything through no fault of her own. He agreed at once to stand as her witness, and it was Soledad, practical in the way that women who have raised children on little enough always seem to be, who suggested that Eula's first move ought not to be toward the bank or the sheriff, both of whom might well be inclined to side with established men of property over a woman the whole town believed disgraced, but toward someone with standing who could not easily be dismissed or bought. That someone, Eula decided after turning the problem over for the better part of a sleepless night, was Judge Augustine Hale, the same circuit judge who had drawn up Thomas Bonner's will 2 years before his death, a man known across 3 counties for a stubborn, old-fashioned rectitude that had cost him more than one comfortable friendship but had never once cost him his reputation for honesty. She rode into the county seat at Tombstone with Refugio beside her as witness and the journal wrapped carefully in oilcloth, and though the judge's clerk at first tried to turn her away as he might any unannounced petitioner, the moment she spoke Royal Cutter's name and the sum of $11,000, Judge Hale himself came to the door of his chambers, his face gone pale and strange, and admitted that he had been a young attorney in Paloma Flats at the time of the robbery, had watched it break families he had grown up among, and had never in 23 years stopped wondering what had become of Royal Cutter and the gold he was rumored, in old saloon talk, to have carried off alone. He read the journal from cover to cover in a single sitting, questioned Eula closely about the canyon, the shack, the cave, and the deed she now legally held, and at the end of it pronounced, with the particular relish of a man finally handed a puzzle he had carried unsolved for half his career, that the journal constituted as fine a piece of evidence as he had seen in 20 years on the bench, that the gold belonged in law and in justice to the listed depositors and their heirs, and that he would personally discover entitled to a finder's portion under territorial law, a portion he fixed, after some calculation, at 1/10 of the total recovered value, a sum that would, on its own, make her a woman of real and independent means for the first time in her life. It was inevitable, in a town as small as Paloma Flats, that word of the discovery would spread before the gold itself had even been carried down out of the canyon, and inevitable too that the news would reach Garrett Bonner within the same day it reached the dry goods store and the saloon and every porch and parlor in between. He arrived at the shack on the 3rd morning after Judge Hale's deputies had begun the careful work of extracting the strongboxes, his face a study in disbelief curdling fast into fury, and he did not at first even seem to register that the gaunt, sun-browned woman directing the deputies with quiet authority was the sister-in-law he had shoved off a canyon rim some 4 months before. When recognition did come, it came violently, his face draining and then flooding red, and he demanded to know by what right she stood there alive, by what right she dared show her face in Paloma Flats after running off in disgrace, and, when the truth of the gold's discovery finally penetrated his shock, by what right a woman with no legal standing in this county presumed to claim a finder's share of a fortune that had been sitting, unclaimed, on land that bordered, as he was quick to point out with a sneer, the very ranch he now held title to. Eula, who had spent 4 months preparing herself for exactly this confrontation, did not flinch and did not raise her voice. She told him, in front of the deputies, in front of Refugio, in front of Judge Hale himself who had ridden out that morning to oversee the final recovery, precisely how she had come to be alive, that he had driven her to the rim of Calder's Canyon and left her there to die rather than face the consequences of the forged deed she had discovered among his belongings, and that she had survived only through the mercy of strangers who owed her family nothing at all. Garrett's denial came fast and loud, a wounded recitation of grief and innocence, but Judge Hale, who had known both Bonner brothers since they were boys and who had, in his long career, developed a sharp ear for the particular cadence of a guilty man's protest, asked him a single quiet question. If his sister-in-law's account was a lie born of madness or vengeance as Garrett claimed, then how did he explain the notary in Bisbee, a man named Otis Drummond, who had that very week been arrested on an unrelated matter of forged livestock bills of sale, and who, under questioning, had already begun naming the men whose forged documents he had drawn up over the years for a price? The color went out of Garrett Bonner's face entirely at the mention of Drummond's name, and in the silence that followed, broken only by the wind moving through the canyon scrub and the soft clink of gold coin being counted into a strongbox a few yards off, every person present understood that the truth had finally caught up to him in a place he could not run from. He did not confess outright. Men like Garrett Bonner rarely do even when cornered, but his bluster collapsed into a kind of stammering retreat, and Judge Hale, with the same unhurried gravity he brought to every matter of law, informed him that he would be summoned to answer formally for both the forged deed and the abandonment of his sister-in-law in a place where her death was the reasonably foreseeable outcome, a charge that in this territory carried weight enough to see a man imprisoned for years. Garrett rode off that morning a broken figure, and within the month, faced with Drummond's testimony and the overwhelming evidence Judge Hale had assembled, he surrendered the Bonner Ranch back to Eula under a settlement that spared him the worst of prison only by trading away every acre and every head of cattle he had so coldly believed himself entitled to, and left Paloma Flats for parts unknown not long after, a man who had tried to erase a woman's claim to what was rightfully hers and had, instead, erased his own. But it was the gold, far more than the ranch, that occupied Eula's thoughts in the weeks that followed, and she involved herself in its distribution with the same careful ledger-keeper's diligence her mother had taught her at 9 years old, cross-referencing Royal Cutter's list of original depositors against the county's old bank records, which Judge Hale had preserved in the courthouse archive, and against the living memory of Paloma Flats's oldest residents, who remembered all too well which families had lost their land and their hope in the autumn of 1863. There was old Mercy Talbot, 81 years old and nearly blind, whose husband had taken his own life within the month of the robbery and who had spent 23 years dependent on the charity of a niece. There was the Okafor family, freed people who had saved for 11 years to buy their small parcel only to see it seized when the bank could not honor its obligations, and who had been forced to start over as tenant farmers on land that had once been their own. There was the widow Inez Carranza, whose late husband's modest savings, lost in the robbery, would have spared their children years of hunger had it remained where it belonged. Eula visited each surviving family or their descendants in turn, the journal and Judge Hale's official accounting in hand, and watched faces that had long since stopped expecting any justice at all crumple with a grief that was, in the end, indistinguishable from relief, the strange particular grief of being believed after decades of being doubted or forgotten. She insisted, against the wishes of more than one official who suggested the town simply divide the recovered fortune evenly to save trouble, that every dollar be traced as precisely as Cutter's. Confession allowed back to the family it had been stolen from, a labor that took the better part of 2 months but that she would not shorten, telling Judge Hale, when he gently questioned the necessity of such care, that a debt repaid carelessly was hardly different from a debt left unpaid at all. With her own finder's portion, and with the ranch restored fully to her name, Eula did not retreat into the comfortable private prosperity that lay easily within her reach. She used a portion of her share to rebuild the very bank that Royal Cutter's robbery had destroyed, chartering it under new and careful management with herself, at Judge Hale's insistence, sitting on its founding board, the first woman in the territory's history, so far as anyone could determine, to hold such a position, and she set aside a further portion to establish a modest relief fund for widows and orphan families passing through hard times, administered with the same exacting fairness she had once brought to the Bonner Ranch's ledgers, so that no family in Paloma Flats would ever again face ruin with nowhere to turn. She had the old line shack at the canyon's mouth not torn down but restored, oddly enough, as a kind of way station for travelers caught short between settlements, stocked always with water and dried goods and a roof that no longer let in the rain, in quiet honor of both Royal Cutter, whose long-delayed conscience had set the whole chain of restoration in motion, and of Refugio and Soledad Salcido, whose unasked for kindness to a broken stranger had taught her, before she ever found a single coin of buried gold, that the most overlooked corners of the world were so often where the truest wealth was kept. And so it was that Eula Bonner, who had been left for dead in a canyon by a man who believed she was worth nothing more than the inconvenience of her continued existence, who had spent her final $3 on a ruin that the whole county agreed no sensible woman would want, came in the end to be remembered not as a tragedy or a curiosity but as the very woman who had restored to Paloma Flats a debt it had carried unknowing for nearly a quarter of a century, a debt sealed away by a dying outlaw's long overdue conscience, and unsealed at last by a woman whose own hard years had taught her exactly what it meant to be written off, dismissed, and underestimated, and exactly how much could be hiding beneath the surface of the things the world had decided were worthless. The town that had once whispered of her disgrace came instead to speak her name with a particular kind of reverence reserved for those rare souls who turn their own ruin into someone else's rescue, and old Mercy Talbot, when asked by a younger neighbor what kind of woman Eula Bonner truly was, said only that she was the kind of woman who looked at a thing the world had thrown away and asked, before anyone else thought to, what it might still be worth. We told you at the beginning of this story that a 28-year-old woman, left for dead by her own kin, would spend her last $3 on a ruin nobody else wanted, and that something sealed beneath its floor would change her life and restore a whole community besides. That is exactly what happened to Eula Bonner, though no one, not Garrett Bonner who left her in the canyon, not the county clerk who tried gently to talk her out of the purchase, Not even Eula herself in that first cold night sleeping on dried grass with the wind moving through the cracks like something breathing, could have guessed that the worthless shack at Calder's Canyon held the means to settle a 23-year-old debt and deliver justice to the very brother-in-law who had thought himself rid of her for good. It is, we think, one of the truest things a hard life can teach a person. That value is so rarely where the world expects to find it, and that the things left for dead, land, ledgers, people, have an uncanny way of holding more than anyone bothered to imagine. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Eula Bonner's story. If it moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who needs reminding that the overlooked corners of their own life might be holding more than they know, and we'd love to hear from you in the comments. What is a time you found real value in something the world around you had already written off? Until next time, stay close.